Hey, what's up everybody? Remi Sovran here from RemiSovran.com. And today I'm back with another presentation which I'm going to be talking about part 2 of exercises to avoid for a disc bulge and disc herniation. And we're going to be specifically talking about static stretches. So what we'll be covering today is we'll talk about a bit of a review from last presentation is what we'll start with. And then we'll get into some stretches to avoid for a low back disc bulge or disc herniation. We'll talk about some stretches that may cause a disc bulge or disc herniation, as well as stretches that are commonly performed in very poor spinal positions or they're performed with bad technique. And this actually may lead to that bulging or herniating mechanism. And we'll talk about the Mackenzie stretch and some of my thoughts and opinions regarding it, as well as should you perform it for a disc bulge or herniation. And lastly, we'll talk about yoga and should you perform yoga or is it advisable for someone with a disc bulge or disc herniation? So to begin with a little bit of a review from last presentation. So last presentation we covered that there are a number of factors. We know that there are a number of factors that could influence the rate of injury. So we could talk about posture. Someone with a forward head posture would be more susceptible to more compression placed on their spine. We look at genetics. Talk about different spines, slender spines versus thicker spines. Look at a diet. Are they consuming a lot of unhealthy types of food? Is it poor? This could all lead to hormonal imbalances, which could all influence the rate someone may recover, or ultimately, if they're looking to improve performance, could affect their performance as well. And we can also look at recovery. So is an individual taking an adequate amount of rest, or are they not recovering properly? Because this could all lead to an increase in the rate of injury. So we also covered exercises such as sit-ups, lateral side bends, and any kind of sort of flexion-based movements. These should all be avoided for someone with like a posterior disc bulge or herniation, specifically within that lower back region, because these exercises are known, especially when you start loading up on them, they could be very problematic. And as you continuously engage in repeated cycles, they're going to create that bulging or herniating mechanism, which is why a lot of people develop these types of injuries in the first place, is from these types of exercises. And we also talked about some dangerous types of exercise, such as the deadlift and squat. And so we talked about how the deadlift and squat, as you begin to load up on these exercises, since these exercises require a substantial amount of technique, as you begin to load up, these exercises can become very problematic. And if you're not performing these exercises with adequate performance and technique, or even if you're fatigued while performing this, they can be very problematic and can create that herniation or bulge. They can cause technique to basically drop, or it could become very poor, and this is how a herniation, bulge, or any sort of disc-related injury could develop. So we also talked about NACA's Min Study, and I want to kind of refer back to that, and I'm going to refer to this kind of study and chart throughout this little presentation today. So what I want to specifically look at is the supine position, where the individual here is laying on their back, the side position, the standing position, the standing bent position, the seated position, the seated bent position. So as you can see, the pressure, the intradiscal pressure is increasing as the position changes. So as we get into a standing position, as opposed to laying on the ground, pressure increases pretty substantially. But as we start rounding our spine, we also have another substantial increase within the intradiscal pressure, as you can see with seated and standing. But being seated and rounding the spine is producing the most intradiscal pressure as compared to the other positions. So ultimately, if you're going to stretch, you want to kind of take yourself out of these positions, whether if you're seated, rounding your back, or if you're standing and rounding your back. It's best to be in a position where you're either standing or you're in a supine position or even prone position to stretch. Those would be the more optimal positions. So I'm going to kind of talk about a lot of stretches throughout this little presentation that commonly people perform with poor posture and how they can be performed in better ways. So to begin, why do we stretch? So there's a number of reasons why we stretch. So firstly, because one is just because it feels good. A lot of people just feel good when they stretch. Other reasons they improve their flexibility and range of motion. It may help with recovery, post-exercise, or post-activity, whatever activity or sport it may be. For injury prevention reasons, we correct asymmetries, whether if you have one hip that is maybe shorter than the other, or there's some sort of, you have a stiffer hip on the right side as opposed to the left side, so you want to kind of correct those asymmetries. Warm-ups, we use dynamic stretching for warm-ups, and we could use maybe static stretching for cool downs. We also do it to loosen up any tightness or stiffness within muscles. So if you have any tightness or stiffness in an area, we'll perform some static stretches to kind of potentially loosen up those regions and improve our range of motion. So now to kind of begin, we're going to start with our problematic stretches. So we could see the seated hamstring stretch or straight leg hamstring stretch is one that we'll be covering. We could also look at the seated groin stretch, toe touches, which is another common hamstring stretch, the Mackenzie stretch / cobra stretch, and any sort of flexion or extension based stretches. So to begin, we see the seated hamstring stretch. So you'll see this commonly performed by a lot of young athletes or individuals, typically within high school and then or even young adulthood. So what you see is, I think this is actually a great picture because you see a lot of these individuals, they're in a seated position and they're all rounding their spines, as you can see as they stretch. They're trying to reach for their right foot, kind of right toe, and they're really excessively kind of forcing themselves to kind of reach their foot. And so by doing this, they're excessively engaging in spinal flexion, and you can see some of their faces here that it doesn't look too comfortable to begin with. So now, not that it's going to cause really a disc bulge or herniation just by doing this, but the problem is these kind of poor techniques and stretches, they stay ingrained in these young individuals' minds throughout kind of their life. And then it's only a matter of time when they combine other sorts of flexion-based exercises that a stretch like this could cause that bulge or herniation to occur later in life. So firstly, just to kind of continue on, if you're someone that suffers from a posterior disc bulge, you'd want to avoid the stretch at all costs, just because the seated position combined with the spinal flexion produces a great deal of intradiscal pressure, and it's only going to make things 1,000 times worse in terms of the pain. So therefore, I would advise you avoid this stretch at all times. So kind of moving on to now a seated hamstring stretch / assessment. So you might have seen this assessment before, you may have actually done this, and you see this commonly performed in labs, or lab researchers may perform this with certain patients, or it may be prescribed from personal trainers or other coaches to kind of assess spinal flexion or hamstring flexibility. Now, I think this is actually a very poor assessment tool, and the reason being is because you're putting the individual into a seated position with their legs both together and straight, and you're having the individual push this little pad as far as they can. And by pushing the pad, by trying to push the pad as far as they can, they're rounding their back and spine here. And so they're forcing themselves into a very poor position, not to mention that they're trying to reach as far as they can. So someone with maybe previous back problems that goes to perform this, they could throw out their back instantly just by forcing themselves to kind of reach as far as they can. And so you could also have someone who may have, this could be even just this assessment could also just be a case where someone that is involved in a certain sport or a certain flexion-based sport where they're always in flexion, when they go to perform this assessment, it could instantly just cause that disc bulge or herniation just to occur, because they're forcing themselves to reach as far as they can, rounding their back while being in that seated position. So it's placing a great deal of pressure onto the spinal disc, and it's not a good assessment tool, and it should be avoided, in my opinion, at all costs. And I don't think people should ever be really performing this assessment tool. So moving on now, so we could also see hamstring stretch toe touches. So this is another common way to kind of stretch the hamstrings, where individuals they'll reach to the ground with their hands. You see a lot of people in high school, a lot of high school students performing this, a lot of gym teachers may be advising this, and they may be even advising this as a flexibility assessment, if you can touch your toes or touch the floor or not. So as you can see here on the picture on the left, the guy has very poor spinal positioning and lower back rounding. And then you can even see here, there's excessive rounding of the spine of this female here. Very excessive. It would not be advisable at all. And this is kind of how these herniations, bulges can occur. And this would be very problematic for someone with already a previous history of having a disc bulge or herniation, or have had previous lower back issues. So there's better ways to stretch the hamstrings without putting so much stress on the disc. There's a lot better ways than rounding the spine. You can stretch the hamstrings in a much more neutral position, which leads me to my next slide, which we have here. Here's two better postures to stretch the spine. So as you can see, here's a picture of myself just standing. I have my foot placed onto a little table here, and I'm just getting a little hamstring stretch here. So what you see is good spinal positioning. I'm in a good neutral position, no rounding of the back. So therefore, I'm sparing the back, reducing the amount of pressure on the disc. So this kind of goes back to NACA Min Study, where when you took that individual that was just standing, there was a much less interdiscal pressure as opposed to rounding the back and standing. And then you could also look at lying on the ground in the supine position, which would even be more less pressure on the back. And you could take some sort of resistance band, or you could have a coach kind of stretch you out and just hold your foot upwards like that and kind of stretch your hamstring out. So these are a lot better positions, but just one tip is don't overstretch it, don't overdo it. Just stretch to the point where you feel tension, because as you overdo it, you could cause more problems, which may be problematic. So one important thing I want to note, though, is that when it comes to any sort of hamstring stretch, if you're someone that has a disc bulge, disc herniation, or you have sciatica for that matter, from that disc bulge or disc herniation, you're more than likely going to want to avoid these stretches. I would advise avoiding these because when you engage in these hamstring sort of stretches, you could stretch the sciatic nerve root out, which would only cause more problems, and it can flare up pain within the low back. So if you can kind of see the picture on the right here, this is actually very similar to a straight leg raise test, which if you're someone that has been assessed before by some sort of practitioner for sciatica, typically they will raise your leg to test for sciatica, and once they raise your leg, if you experience pain, then this is an indicator that you may have that sciatica may be present. So you would typically want to avoid these if you have a disc bulge or disc herniation, or specifically sciatica for that matter. However, if you're someone with a good healthy spine, these are better ways to stretch the hamstring as opposed to being in those rounded positions. So moving on now, we can see another specific stretch. We can see the seated groin stretch, which I commonly see performed very poorly by a lot of people. So this stretch obviously is focusing on stretching the groins, so kind of our adductor muscles right here. And what you'll often see is a lot of people will get in the seated position and they will round their back just to kind of get a much deeper stretch, and they'll push on their knees with their elbows. The problem is, by being in this position, you're already creating a great deal of interdiscal pressure, and you're combining with the flex position, there's that great deal of pressure. And so if you do repeated and sustained holds of the stretch, it could be very detrimental, and it would be very problematic. So there are better ways to kind of stretch the groins out than this, which brings me to my next slide, which we see some better alternatives here. So we can see a standing side lunge here on the right, and we can see a supine band stretch on the left here. So a supine band stretch, you could also use a coach or trainer to kind of hold your leg in that position. Both these positions are much better, and you're not getting that rounding of the spine, or you're not in that seated position, much less interdiscal pressure, and you're sparing the spine. So these are both better alternatives than to that seated groin stretch. So now moving on to the Mackenzie and Cobra stretch. So when it comes to the Mackenzie stretch / kind of Cobra stretch, now the Mackenzie stretch is often prescribed to kind of treat individuals with a posterior disc bulge or disc herniation in the lower back. And so the thought process with it is that when an individual engages in the Mackenzie stretch, so as you can see in the bottom picture here, I have a green arrow. The idea is someone with a posterior disc bulge, so the disc bulge is moving posterior here. By engaging extension, you're moving the disc forward and back, or downwards and back into place, which in theory is a very good thought process. But now I'm going to explain in a second why this can be very problematic. So firstly, with the Mackenzie stretch or the Cobra stretch, which you kind of see in yoga, the problem is that you're engaging in an excessive low back extension. So someone with any sort of stress fracture within the vertebra, or someone that has problems with the facet joints, this could irritate symptoms already. So if someone has arthritis in the lower back, by getting into that extension position and doing a number of repetitions or holding the position can be very problematic and can make things worse for those joints and for the vertebra, and can place a great deal of compression onto the spine. So that's one reason why I already don't like this stretch at all, and I typically will advise against performing this. Secondly, someone with a disc bulge or disc herniation that performs it, I often get people telling me that they experience pain when performing the Mackenzie stretch. And they tell me that they have maybe an L4, L5, L5S1 disc bulge, and when they go to perform the stretch and they get into that extended position, as you can see in the bottom picture here, when they get into that extended position, they have pain, they get flare-ups. And so I know when I had my disc bulge, this was one of the first stretches that someone advised me to perform in terms of helping me with my recovery. And so I performed it. I tried it out for a couple of weeks, but I noticed that it actually caused my back to flare up as well. And so I kind of wondered this over time. And so what I came to realize was that the thing is with a disc bulge or disc herniation that is bulging posteriorly. Now, with the idea of engaging in this extension position, the spine on the anterior side here, the vertebrae are going to open up. So the vertebrae are going to open up, and it's going to cause the herniation or bulge to kind of move forward. The problem is, though, since the bulge or herniation is already kind of outside of its original position, the vertebrae, what ends up happening is that when you engage in that extension, they're coming closer together on the posterior side. So what that's going to do now is that as they come closer, they're going to basically squeeze that bulge, or they're going to squeeze that disc together, and it could cause that bulge to kind of move further outwards posteriorly, since there's no room, no room at all as you engage in that extension position. And so that could cause that already bulging disc or herniated disc to move further out, and it'll hit that sciatic nerve and cause a flare-up to occur. So this is how pain could be created during the Mackenzie stretch, and this is why a lot of people may experience pain. Now, this might not happen in all cases, but I know a lot of people have talked to me about this and told me they have experienced pain, and I specifically experienced pain when performing it. So that's kind of the thought process going through, is that the vertebrae are coming closer together on the posterior side, which is causing them to pinch the bulge or herniation, moving it further out, which is going to hit the sciatic nerve and may cause pain, which actually may make things worse. So typically, I advise against performing this stretch just because, number one, you're engaging in that excessive low back extension, which isn't good to begin with and could cause problems with the facet joints, with the vertebrae if you already have pre-existing problems, with arthritis or whatever it may be. And then you have the case with the bulge or herniation where it can cause a flare-up and it could pinch kind of that sciatic nerve as you get into that extended position. So now when it comes to any sort of flexion or extension stretches, I typically would advise avoiding them as much as possible in order to kind of maintain a healthy spine and maintain the longevity of your spine. So any sort of kind of spinal flexion or extension-based stretches, it's best to kind of get into a neutral posture, neutral position if you're going to stretch certain muscles out, and try to avoid getting into these positions to begin with. Because if you're in these positions for a long period of time and you're holding these sustained positions and you're doing this for a number of if you're doing these stretches for every day or whatever it may be, it could ultimately create that bulge or herniation to occur, especially if you combine that with other kind of flexion or extension-based movements that you may be doing in everyday life. So it's best to avoid these types of flexion or extension stretches, and it's best to stretch in positions that will spare the spine. So a neutral spinal position would be best maintained. So now lastly, we'll talk about my thoughts on yoga here. So is yoga advisable for someone with a disc bulge or disc herniation in the low back for a posterior disc bulge or disc herniation? So in my opinion, I believe that some yoga stretches are beneficial, where I believe that others are not. The problem that I see with yoga is that there are a lot of excessive flexion and excessive extension-based type of positions or stretches that individuals are performing. So as you see in the top position, you see this kind of downward dog kind of position, where the butt's up in the air and the lower back here is rounding. So if someone that had a posterior disc bulge with the L4, L5 level, this stretch would only make things worse, because you're causing that disc bulge to move out further, or disc herniation to move out further. And then you could say, and then you can even look at the bottom position. If you have low back extension patterns, you have someone with extension-based back pain. Engaging these excessive extension positions are only going to make things worse as well. So ultimately, the thing is with yoga, I would advise against performing it if you're someone with a disc bulge or disc herniation, just because there's a lot of positions and stretches out there that could be very detrimental to you if you start engaging in them, especially if you have sciatic pain. So it would be best to kind of make your recovery first, and then if you're someone that really enjoys yoga, then you can get back into it. Now, I'm not against yoga in any way. I think it's actually a great way to kind of relieve the mind, relaxation, kind of even loosen certain muscles up, and just overall a great kind of relaxation method for someone to kind of relieve the mind. So the thing is, though, is just if you have a disc bulge disc herniation, avoid it until you've made a full recovery, and then you can kind of return to yoga. But just be very cautious and be very careful, because if you're someone that does have a disc bulge disc herniation, you make your recovery, then you return to yoga. Be very cautious of some of the positions that you're getting in, and just remember that you've already suffered a disc bulge disc herniation, and that some of these certain stretches could make things worse. So it's maybe best to maybe avoid some of the stretches and just be very careful when maybe doing yoga. So those are just kind of my thoughts on yoga. So just be careful with it. So now here's an important question that we got to ask ourselves. How and where do these poor spinal positions develop? So we can look to poor coaches or ill-advised trainers. We can look at the mainstream media misinformation. And then we can look at poor technique. Usually begins in childhood sports and kind of stays ingrained with us until an injury develops. So here I have like a picture of kind of like a title of an article you may see on the internet or in a book or something like that, which says 5 stretches to fix lower back pain instantly. So this is where a lot of misinformation occurs, and you have a lot of people that maybe have back pain will go and search the website for some sort of back pain remedies, relief, exercise, stretches, whatever it may be, and they'll read an article like this. The problem is when they read these articles, the individual, they might display these certain stretches and tell them to do these stretches, but they're so general and they're not specific to the individual's injury. So there might be a flexion-based stretch in that article or in that kind of program that the individual is suggesting. And if someone has a posterior disc bulge and goes to do that, they're only going to make things worse. So this is kind of where we get our misinformation from the internet, from mainstream media, or just a lot of ill-advised coaches or trainers. And the same thing would be advised with, or the same thing would be seen with trainers or coaches, that they may go read an article like this and then apply it to their client that has lower back pain, and they're only going to make things worse by applying maybe a certain stretch that the individual shouldn't be performing. So ultimately, you got to be very careful when you are on looking for certain reliefs or kind of ways to kind of relieve lower back pain. You got to be very careful because everyone's case is different. And when you just kind of read articles like this and start performing stretches, be very careful because you don't know for sure if it's going to be good or not for you. Because you don't know, because there's a lot of things you can take into account. You can look at the credibility of the individual, who's writing it, do they really know how to fix back pain? Because you got to think, have they experienced back pain themselves? What kind of back pain have they experienced? Have they treated anyone with back pain? So there's a lot of factors to take into account. So it's really important to do your research and find someone that actually really knows their stuff. So also I want to just talk about poor technique usually begins in childhood sports. So often if you ever go to a youth soccer game, youth hockey game, you'll see a lot of individuals performing stretches with their backs rounded, flexed, whether those kind of seated stretches I mentioned before, those toe touches. You see a lot of those stretches, they are performed with a lot of young athletes or individuals, and then they're kind of carried over until later into adulthood or throughout their life until maybe an injury occurs and they realize that they can't perform those stretches and they should avoid them, and then they start educating themselves and learning about why these stretches may be bad. So that's just kind of that's just something I want to share with you guys. Just be careful with a lot of the information you consume, and don't just kind of always look for the credibility of look at the credibility of the individual. And what does this information provide you? Is it good information? Does it work for you? If it works for you, then good, and continue with it. If it doesn't work for you, then kind of remove it immediately, especially if it's causing pain or issues. So in conclusion, ultimately we need to do a better job about educating individuals, specifically the younger population, about spinal positioning health. There's too much poor information out there, and a lot of ill-advised stretching and exercise routines that are only causing injuries and making a lot of people, affecting a lot of people's careers, which is very problematic within today's society. So ultimately, it's best to avoid stretches that put the spine in a very jeopardized position or in a high pressure instance. So if you're going to stretch in a way that's going to spare the spine, not in a way where the spine is in a jeopardized position or flexed position, because that's only going to kind of create that bulging or herniation mechanism. And if you kind of do that repeatedly, that's how we get these injuries occurring. So guys, that's just kind of my little presentation of exercises to avoid for disc bulge or disc herniation part 2, where we talked about static stretching. If you have any questions or comment kind of regarding this presentation, please be sure to leave some comments below. And if you guys enjoyed this and found this very helpful, please be sure to give us a thumbs up and share this video, because I believe that a lot of people within today's society are misinformed about the way that they should be performing certain exercises and stretches, and it's best that we can inform these people they could have a greater career, perform better as an athlete, and also ultimately improve the longevity of their health and specifically their spinal health. So guys, I wish you guys all the best and a successful and productive day. So for that, take care, and I will see you later.